myself and take the video off, but I'm still here.
Yeah, that's fine.
You're good.
Now, if I've set up everything, we should be streaming to Twitch and to YouTube and to my Facebook profile. So there should be more people than are even present watching. I'm going to check to see if that is happening. If I go to my YouTube, or how about my Twitch? Yeah, it looks like it's going. We got somebody asking something. That's fine. That's fine, Milos. Change role to attendee. Yeah, see, the thing is, you can do either a Zoom meeting or you can do a seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Now, with a meeting, you have everybody on camera and talking, and it's a discussion. But limit 100 participants.
Mm-hmm.
You know how many we got RSVP'd for this?
Well, you said 130.
Well, I stopped counting after 170.
Oh, Jesus.
We're way over 220 by now.
Oh.
I don't know. It might be a record.
Okay, good.
Philosophy group. Yeah, after 170, I just stopped counting.
So the way that the seminar works is that only the people who are on the
Seminar
panel can speak?
That's right. You just, well, no, on camera.
Mm-hmm.
A panelist can be on camera. I can unmute anybody who's an attendee, but they won't be on camera.
Okay. So how does that work with the discussion?
Yeah, so people will have to raise their hand if they want to
Mm-hmm.
question, or write in a question into the chat room, and we'll take them one by one, which is yeah, the only way we're going to be able to do it for this many people.
Mm.
Let's see what we got here. Hamilton psychotherapy. Anybody want to? We got some time. Anybody want to either discuss maybe what they got out of the reading? If everybody read the chapter, what a barn burner that was, wasn't it? My goodness, the power of her thought, the power of her thinking, and the strength of her sentences. It's incredible. Mm.
Did you read both the essay, What is Freedom, and the action chapter, or just the action chapter?
No, I didn't. I don't remember to read What is Freedom, but I did read Action. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I put it on what it. Oh, well, got him here. What is Freedom? No, I don't think I put that on the list for reading. Mm-hmm.
That's okay. Yeah.
But I do remember reading it a long time ago. So yeah, if anybody wants to say anything or say what they got out of the chapter, type a question. I can promote you to a speaker. 14 people here. Let me check. Yeah, that's right. We were talking about that. She was she was an editor. And the question was, did she have any hand in the Kafka editions?
She did.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Mostly in the diary, bringing out the diary, together with funny enough, with the brother of Clement Greenberg, Martin Greenberg, who did a bunch of the translations, even though he was not a translator and his German was not that good.
Yeah. That can be difficult.
Yeah, well, those were the kind of post-war conditions, right? Like people just sort of like had some kind of running knowledge of German, and then she consulted on the translations, obviously. But her English wasn't that great after just a few years being here. So.
Yeah, well, got pretty good eventually.
Mm-hmm. QA.
Now I want to check. My channel. Multi-streaming on YouTube. Ooh, I guess I should. Schmidt. Yeah, well, I don't think there's a difference. It's just another. Well, I mean, it's not really a chat. It's just a place. I guess if you show it in the Q&A, somehow I'm supposed to think that takes higher priority or something. Yeah, chat is just a chat, but I don't think it'll get too chaotic. A chat is just for people to chat, not necessarily. Hey, Dan. You're in the Q&A. Dan. Chat in the chat room. There we go. You got it. So I can promote anybody if we got 10 minutes. Anybody want to discuss what they got out of the reading? Maybe a few initial. She does have a way of constructing a sentence, doesn't she? All those parenthetical clauses, just one after the other. It's like you could put parentheses over every one of those clauses, but then in addition to, and what as well as, and still be in the same sentence.
Oh, that's funny. I didn't notice that. I guess it's a very German thing to do.
I imagine so, yes. I do envy bilingualists. I only have the one. My mother's Mexican, but she never spoke Spanish around us, so we didn't pick it up. So missed opportunity there. She just said it was just easier to just get it out in English. So. Algebraic sentence construction. Yeah, so anybody who wants to talk would have to raise their hand specifically or say something in the chat room.
So we can do the same thing during the talk, right? I can like have a pause and have someone raise their hand to speak, theoretically.
Yeah, that would be enough. Yeah.
Cool.
I'll put anybody onto, well, if you can hear us, then you're in. Someone's asking. I'll put anybody on camera if they would like, but 37, and we haven't even started yet. 7 minutes to go. Yeah, it's really going to be more of a presentation. No, I think we'll wait till 4 starts. We're going for 2 hours, and an extra 6 minutes isn't going to make much difference. We're at 40. I'm curious. I'm curious to see who's going to show. I was talking about this earlier. I said I don't have a. I did. I was keeping a tally of all the RSVP yeses, but then I have it on another computer and I didn't transfer it, and it's too late to retrieve it. But and then somebody, thinking they were being helpful, gave me the RSVP to attendee list for one of the groups. 25. We're already past that. 25. We're already at 40.
There's someone asking if it will be recorded because they can't listen right now?
Well, it's streaming to Twitch. It'll be there. It's streaming to YouTube. It'll be there. It's streaming to my Facebook page. It'll be there. I think I have set up Zoom so that it'll stream to the cloud. So I'll have a recording so I can do anything I would want with it. It should be widely available. I think all I have to do is that. Okay, well, here's a kind of a meaty question. We may want to get this one in the presentation, unless it's a quick answer. I don't know. It was just a the differences between action and work, and I forget what else he said. What I'm gonna do is allow to talk. Oh, hey, Dan. I'm getting allow to talk is not available. You're using an older version of Zoom. But I can promote you to panelists. That I can do. Hey, Dan. There you go. You're here. Sorry, didn't mean to do that for you. Caught you off guard.
So can you go over the chapter numbers? I didn't have page number reference on my ebook. I did 23 through 30. I think that was the right range.
So in this, the standard edition of the Human Condition, it's the action section or chapter, and that's 24 to 34.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, okay. I stopped shy a couple chapters. I only got to 30.
That's okay. So you missed out on the parts about forgiveness and the promise, but you can make a promise to yourself to. I'm just kidding.
I got a lot out of that part of it, forgiveness. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Oh, interesting question. Did she write the thing in English? Yeah, given that she was bilingual. Didn't she?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, she wrote a lot of, almost all of her books after 1941 in English, but then she also wrote it in German. So yes, and both.
Again, anybody wants to chat in just the last couple of minutes here?
I was kind of surprised that there was not an existing free audiobook on YouTube, for instance. There were plenty of people discussing it, but no one actually narrating. Maybe it was hard to get the rights or something like that. I know you have to get the rights when you make an audio book.
Once again, for everybody who doesn't know, I'm going to have to promote you if you want to be on camera or speak. Otherwise, and I'll be happy to do that. Just let me know. All right, somebody C. All right, we got a little bit of time here.
Hello.
Hey, all.
All right, I think what I'll do is this. Jan, mute, C, mute. Seems mute. Yeah, that's what I was afraid of. All right, well, I think we're at the hour, so we ought to, let's, oh, I should go to panelists, that's right. Okay, yeah, well, we're at the hour, so we probably should get started here. In my opinion, I think Hannah Arendt is one of the most incisive and powerful thinkers of the 20th century. The strength of her thought was virtually unparalleled. She certainly was a wide-ranging thinker, and surprisingly, she is underrepresented, I feel, in contemporary philosophical studies, and deserves to be regarded more than she is. To that extent, this is why I invited Jana V. Schmidt to present today on a topic of her choice, and she'll present on Hannah Arendt and some of her ideas about action and speech and how we create a sense of self and answer the question, who are we? Who is the I that I am, that I think I am? So let me turn things over to Jana V. Schmidt.
Hi, everyone. Just as a sort of like bit of background, I did a PhD in comparative literature, so I'm not a philosopher, full disclosure, which probably means that I can't answer your intricate questions about Heidegger and Kant, sorry. And I approach Hannah Arendt's writings a little bit differently than I think a classically trained philosopher would. You know, you might consider that a disadvantage, but on the other hand, she never considered herself a philosopher either. So to me, that gives me the right to speak about her. I did a PhD in comparative literature, and then was at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard for a couple of years, which is a wonderful institution that does a lot of sort of theoretical discussion and political cultural programming around the legacy of Hannah Arendt. Just as a sort of like, I guess, to start us off, if you have any issues hearing me or receiving an image that won't go away and it's not related to your internet connection, then just try to chat David, and maybe he can see if he can fix that. There will be a few moments in this presentation where I'll ask you things, sort of more like a seminar, or like a you know, teaching situation. And please feel free in those moments to feel spoken to, right? And to, you can either type something into the chat or you can ask to speak, either with or without video. And I'll try to create some room for that in the presentation so that it's not just me speaking to you for an hour. All right, so the title of the presentation is Hannah Arendt, Action and Thinking Plurality. And I would like to start us off on two sort of moments of observation. One has to do with her work and one doesn't. One has to do, the other one has to do with the current political moment. And I hope to sort of like connect those two moments through the presentation, but they may not immediately feel related for you guys. So the first moment happened just a few days ago, at the Juneteenth protests and celebration in downtown LA. And I was participating in a protest led by a group of activists. I don't even know what kind of organization they were a part of, but one of the speakers gave this sort of rousing speech about the responsibility of white Americans. And one of her major points that got me thinking was that the current sort of, I'm gonna close this window, sorry. Sorry. One of the things she said in her speech was, this is not a political issue, this is a moral issue. And what I took that to mean was that now there's a bit of feedback in the recording. I hope that will go away. Sorry about that. What I took that to mean, so her stress on saying this is not a political issue, it's a moral issue, is, you know, on the one hand, simply to point out that Black lives deserve honoring and protection the same that white lives do, and that this is a moral decision for Americans to make, to actually not just grant people their rights, but also to make good on that promise. So in that sense, she was simply saying, this is not a partisan issue. This is not a for or against issue. This is an issue of whether you can relate to others and feel empathy for others. The implicit question during that moment that the speaker was asking, I think, was simply, why is this taking so long, right? Why can't white Americans bring themselves to commit and do the right thing? And I thought these were eminently important questions. But her emphasis on it being a moral rather than a political issue also made me think how curious it is that at such an eminently political moment, or a moment that I at least am experiencing as a very political moment, the very activists that are fueling that moment speak about it as in anti-political terms, right? So she felt the need to say that this is not political. So that's the first moment I want to start us off with. The second moment is from Hannah Arendt's Thought Notebook, which is this massive tome of 2 volumes. It's scheduled to appear in English in, I think, this year or maybe next year with COVID. And it is essentially sort of like her notes towards developing her major works, but also sometimes the notes go off on tangents that never end up in her work. But sort of like I think they're a beautiful way to sort of like follow her, the patterns of her thinking and the kind of resources she draws on, the people that she's reading, etc. So the second moment that I want to point to is from December 1950, which is right at the beginning of her thought book. She started it in 1950. And in that moment, she writes about the affinity between the philosopher and the tyrant. She writes in German, die abendländische Logik, die als Denken und Vernunft gilt, ist tyrannisch by definition. And she has that little last bit in English, characteristically. So I won't assume that you all speak German. I'll translate it for you. Occidental logic, which stands for thought and reason, is tyrannical by definition, she says. So it's a kind of a biggie. Occidental logic, which stands for thought and reason, is tyrannical by definition. In that same entry, she notes that logic doesn't allow for freedom, which is why it's tyrannical. And if you organize a state according to the principle of reasonableness, then tyranny makes actually the best sense because it's the most efficient. And then the question that I actually wanted to draw your attention to is at the very bottom of her entry, she asks, is there a thinking that isn't tyrannical? So this very question is the second moment that I want to point your attention to. Is there a thinking that isn't tyrannical? In order to understand these two moments together and to grasp Arendt's question about non-tyrannical thinking, I want to step back a little and introduce you to some of the ways Arendt allows us to think about politics. So the question, what is politics for her? And the connection between thought and action. To draw these two concerns together, I want to try and answer the question by the end of this presentation, what is political thinking? Okay, so before I turn to the chapter on action in Arendt's The Human Condition, this book, I want to tell you a bit about her just for not her entire biography, but just some sort of like relevant tidbits for context. She grew up in Königsberg, which is today's Kaliningrad. And as you may know, it's Königsberg, Kaliningrad is the city of Kant, Immanuel Kant. The city, incidentally, that he never left during his entire lifetime and where he came up with his concept of cosmopolitanism, right? So it's a little funny. Königsberg was part of the Prussian state, but it was separated from Germany. And I think that's significant because she shares this sort of history of a divided origin, both linguistically and geographically, a kind of like colonial history with some of the major thinkers of the 20th century. So think about Freud in Moravia, which is part of the Czech, was part of Czechoslovakia, but also part of other states at various moments, empires. Fanon in Martinique, a colony of France, Derrida in Algeria, right? So all of these thinkers that have this kind of like history of a divided origin. In her 20s, she studied with Jaspers and Heidegger in Marburg. And I think what's significant about that is Heidegger and Jaspers to some extent broke with the classical disciplines of philosophy. So instead of the sort of traditional division in philosophy into epistemology, logic, and aesthetics and ethics, Heidegger breaks with this kind of dogmatic separation of the philosophical disciplines. And he famously said, what he wants to do is not thinking about something, but thinking something. Right? So there's a difference between like taking something as an object versus thinking as almost like a kind of doing. Then Arendt obviously flees the Nazis. She's Jewish. First she goes to France and then she escapes to the United States in 1941. And I think that the loss, that the tremendous loss that this entails, right? The loss of an entire world of philosophical and poetic references colors her arrival in the United States. And it subsequently colors all of her different projects, right? This sort of like experience of totalitarianism remains central to the motivation for her writing. She becomes a political activist and she's active in several rescue efforts, in sort of leftist Zionist organizations before the foundation of the State of Israel, and as a journalist. One of the major questions of those years, and I think sort of like in general, is how do we reestablish politics after the Holocaust, right? After this complete destruction of politics and of relations. And the last point that I want to sort of like draw your attention to is her bilingualism or multilingualism. The question has already been asked about whether she wrote The Human Condition in German or in English. And I said, well, yes, both, because she first wrote it in American, and then she wrote a German version. But if you take The Human Condition and the German version called Vita Activa, you'll find that these are two different books. So only about 30% of the book is the same book, and all the rest is either slightly different or completely different. And I think that that's absolutely remarkable for a thinker in the 20th century. I think she's almost, if not the only thinker who did this. With each one of her works, she writes it in both languages. So that for a bit of sort of biographical background. What I want to do in the following is answer two questions. The first question is, what is politics for Hannah Arendt? And the other question is, what is political thinking? And I'll turn mainly to two texts, The Human Condition from 1958. So a few years after she writes her famous Origins of Totalitarianism, which immediately sort of like caused her to be a kind of intellectual celebrity. And this wonderful volume of essays called Between Past and Future, which I know you didn't read, but I really recommend it. It has a collection of essays that were all written in the 1950s. Some were written for German magazines, others for American magazines, and they all speak to a kind of like political occasion, a moment, or a sort of urgent political question of the day. The Human Condition is, as you may have read, often called her philosophical magnum opus. But characteristically, even this so-called magnum opus starts with an almost anti-philosophical question. And that is, her question in the German volume is, what is it that we do when we are active? In English, or in the American version rather, she says what she wants to do in the book is to think what we are doing. So note the subtle difference between the questions. What is it that we do when we are active? And to think what we are doing, right? But in either case, what she wants to do is not think about the sort of classical philosophical questions of being and time and death, or moral questions like the good and the bad. She wants to think what we are doing. And she wants to think where we're at in light of totalitarianism, as I've already said, the destruction of political relations, but also newer phenomena like the atom bomb and the possibility of creating artificial life. And another sort of added background is the specter of automation that looms large in the 1950s. So the kind of like increasing redundancy of traditional forms of labor. In order to rethink the possibilities of the political, she departs from the usual focus of philosophical analysis on the vita contemplativa, so the contemplative life, and sketches a phenomenology of activities. So again, very kind of like unphilosophical approach. Instead of giving us philosophical concepts, she gives us these experiential activities. And she comes up with this trinity of three concepts, right, in the beginning of the human condition. There's labor, there's work, and there's action. Two of those concepts, which we're not going to be focusing on today, are located on the side of what she calls necessity. So labor and work are concerned with the necessities of life. Specifically, labor is basically the maintenance and recreation of the life force. So think things like food, right? Raising children, right? But also things like recreating the means of subsistence through labor. Work is associated, originally associated by her more with the production of a singular work. So things like craftsmanship in the Middle Ages or art. But in the modern period, in the modern age, she says work increasingly becomes just labor, so that now we have ended up in a society of laborers. Action, on the other hand, is distinct from these two because other than the sort of the concern with necessity, action is really concerned with freedom. It's a public activity versus the privacy of labor and work. And it's a world creating activity, if you will, as opposed to the world alienation that marks specifically the processes of labor. We're going to focus on action here because for her, action is really the originally political activity. But just as a sort of side note, I should point out that this kind of trinity of activities in her work is very tightly related. So if you pull on one, it's as if you're pulling on a network of strings, right? You're going to move the other two as well, which speaks to her method as well, I think. So in this sense, her activities, as I've already said, are not philosophical concepts that can be extracted and applied to other cases. Rather, what she tries to do is to get at the phenomenological basis, the kinds of fundamental experiences that underlie what she calls the human condition. So action is first defined in the human condition as the, quote, the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter. This is on page 7, if you have it in front of you. Action, the only activity that goes on directly between men without the intermediary of things or matter, corresponds to the human condition of plurality, to the fact that men, not man, live on the earth and inhabit the world. What does that mean to you, this definition of action as without the intermediary of things? I'm curious how you read that. So now would be one of those moments for someone to either raise their hand to say something, or you can type something into the chat room. Action is not the marketplace, says Mary Finn. Yeah, exactly. So it's not an exchange process. It's not like you get one thing in exchange for another thing. The intellectual faculties, right? Without agency, how do you mean? It means that we have to interact face to face, exactly. So the end goal of action is not a product, right? We're not creating art. We're not even, even if we're in a political context, we're not even necessarily sort of like working towards a concrete goal. The point of action is the relation itself, right? It is in a sense, it is the point of action is in the action. So it's not, as Brandon says, geared towards utility or necessity. Exactly. We don't need action, right? We could organize our entire society perfectly well as a sort of utilitarian system in which nobody needs to act together. We don't need politics. We just have this sort of like ginormous bureaucracy that regulates everything, right? And in many ways, you'd think that that's actually the ideal of current, of many current political activists, right? For instance, you know, this sort of like verb of fixing things that is constantly used. Trump uses it, and now Democrats use it too. The idea that you can fix things means that you just, you know, it's like work. It's not like an actual political process of coming to a conclusion, agreeing, whatever, right? So action doesn't produce an object. It doesn't have a goal other than itself, but it's also not useless, right? It's not like art, and I put useless in quotations here. Obviously, art has uses. The point of action is that it's productive of certain relationships among people, right? So if you will, if there is any such thing as a goal, the goal is to create relationships. This is why Arendt stresses the second point. So in the quote that I read to you, she says that plurality is the condition of action. And that is because we are both same as humans, we're all human, and distinct, right? And this is important. In order for us to have politics, to be engaged in action, we have to have both a basic sameness and a distinction that necessitates communication. Because if we don't, if we were really all the same, then we wouldn't need to communicate about our different ideas of how the world should be. Our shared world is not an automatic result of us being next to one another, that is. And as I already said, so if we were not all different, then we wouldn't need to communicate about the world. In that case, we would have what Heidegger calls Kuhwärme, cow's warmth. So we would just be sort of like huddled together in like close proximity, and we would have the warmth of our bodies, right? But we wouldn't have any conflicts or tension or things to talk about, really. For Arendt, the world consists in the plurality of its perspectives, right? In the plurality of its perspectives. In other words, the world is in the in-between, right? Between you and me, right? Between all of us together, we can create a world. Which means that the world is not just like the stuff, right? It's not like sort of like a realistic understanding of like, a realist understanding of like matter. It is the sort of like intersubjective thing that grows between contact among people. Which also doesn't mean it's transcendental, I should note. To define action further, Arendt gives us the concept of natality. And this is a really, really interesting concept, I think. So basically, her basic idea in defining action through natality is that she says, each new person possesses the capacity of beginning something anew, that is, of acting. Which means that our ability to begin something anew is grounded in the fact that we come to the world as beginners, right? This is what she means by natality. It's our bornness, the fact that we are born, right? And the fact that we are born in an already existing context, but that each new being in her account, can start something anew. I think this is also interesting in the context of Black Lives Matter and of the current movements for climate change, right? Or against climate change, rather. Because this, I think it's exactly this capacity to begin anew that Black Lives Matter activists and climate activists are pointing to as being stifled by what we're currently doing, right? So they're saying the newcomer at this moment does not have a chance to begin something new if no space is given to them, right? So, or if we literally ruin the earth, right? There's literally no space anymore. But both of these moments, both of these movements, Black Lives Matter and climate activists, also remind us of the beginning power of political movements, right? That in spite of it all, there still is this potential to start something new. So the category of natality is Arendt's way of rewriting existentialism in a way. She's basically asking the question, what if we made birth the starting point for political philosophical reflection, not death, right? So rather than being towards death, as Heidegger has it, she presents us with being from birth. And for those of you who are familiar with feminist thinking, this is kind of like a powder box, right? Like this is a really radical idea that we could conceive the entire tradition of Western philosophy, reconceive it from the point of birth. Because first of all, if we do that, it reminds us that we do not come from nothing, as philosophers have said for, centuries, basically. We all have a mother, right? Meaning, that sounds silly, but what that means is that we are plural from the beginning, right? There is a witness, there is an other right from the beginning, and that other is usually the mother, right? Which is also why this possibility of creating artificial life worries her. But that's a topic for another day. Based on her description of action, Arendt's definition of politics differs from philosophical understandings by a ton. So politics for her is not about the regulation of life. It's not about amassing power in the traditional sense. And it's not about distilling the will of the people as Rousseau has it, right? Most importantly, perhaps, for our purposes today, is that she counters Plato's idea that politics is about rule, right? And this idea that politics is about rule, about governing and being governed, still dominates our understanding of what politics is. And it motivates people to say, oh, this is not political, right? Because the idea that politics is about rule is really an idea that says that politics is an instrument, right? And Arendt vehemently denies that we should think of politics this way. For her, politics is not an instrument. It's not about affecting certain intended goals, as we said before, without intermediary, right? So politics is not a matter of means ends calculations, right? If we see politics as a means ends calculation, she says we have to live with the murderous consequences of that. And she often quotes this wonderful saying, if you want to make an omelet, you have to break eggs, right? That is the logic of totalitarianism. Which is to say, totalitarianism absolves the means as long as a certain end is achieved, right? In place of this extremely entrenched Western idea of politics, Arendt proposes that politics is in fact about power, but she reconceives what we understand by power. She understands power communicatively, so it's really about people power, right? And people power arises between people, so from the faculty of action. to explain this idea of action, or to further contextualize it, she turns in the human condition to the Greek polis. And I think the reason why she turns to the polis is to think about the kind of structure that is needed to best enable collective action and the generation of power, right? So her point in doing so isn't that we should return to the polis. It's not like a historical model for her. It's to point out that the polis offers an organizational structure for living together. And she rewrites this idea not as an ideal, but as a grid that allows us to see certain things in the present more clearly. The polis, as she sort of describes it in the human condition, is a space where I can appear to others without worrying about my household, right? So by household, she means things like work, family, or the body. In the polis, I encounter others as my equals to debate common affairs. So really everything from, you know, human rights questions to the banal things of everyday things like streetlights that can influence your life would be debated in this common space of the polis. I should note that obviously the Greek polis was not an equal place in the sense that slaves and women and non-property holding people were excluded, which is why I think it's important to stress that this is not a model for her. It's not something that we should return to, right? She's not being nostalgic for the polis. She's looking at it systematically as a kind of organizational structure for how to think politics anew. A modern version of the polis, or a different version for her that she returns to frequently in her writing, is the council system, right? So think of the sort of like council system before the October Revolution, or the council system in the Weimar Republic. And you know, you could think of many more examples of kind of council-like structures that all of which have the same in common, which is that it's not an idea of representative democracy where one person sort of like is voted and then forever kind of like represents the will of the people, right? Which we know has all kinds of problems. But the council system is a way of maximizing participation of people locally, like in the neighborhood or in the factory. So essential to her description of the polis is the experience of freedom. She basically says that we cannot make the experience of freedom anywhere except in the political realm. In What is Freedom, which is included in Between Past and Future, she tells us that freedom does not appear in the realm of thought, right? So even our sort of like very thinking about freedom has been influenced by this sort of denial of the political space, right? When we think of freedom commonly and the way that it's presented to us in advertising, it's often presented, or almost always presented, as an individual thing, right? Your individual freedom to take a motorcycle ride, or to, you know, the freedom to buy, right? She says freedom cannot be experienced in thought, and it can't be experienced alone. Meaning, so when she says that freedom does not appear in the realm of thought, she means that when we are with ourselves, we don't feel free. We may feel the push and pull of willing. We may feel the sort of radicality of our doubt nagging at us. We may feel, we may experience things like causality thinking, right? One thing leads to another. But freedom is only experienced in company. And she has this wonderful quote in What is Freedom, where she says, the raison d'être of politics, so the reason for its being, is freedom, and its field of experience is action. The raison d'être of politics is freedom, and its field of experience is action. I want to give you an example for that, just so you can have a better sort of like experience of what she's actually talking about. In the preface to Between Past and Future, she speaks about the activism of the French Resistance during the occupation of France by the Nazis. And she says that what happened in the Resistance is that the people who participated in it for the first time experienced a kind of freedom and a kind of liberation of their individuality, really. It sounds paradoxical, but if you've ever been active in a political organization, I think maybe you recognize this experience of at one and the same time feeling extremely fulfilled and recognized and seen, and simultaneously it not mattering who you are, what color your skin is, what gender you are, what experiences you have, even what character you have, really doesn't bind you in the same way anymore as it does in everyday life. And she calls this, what she says about this is that in political activism, we lose our masks, right? The masks that we put on to feel protected in everyday life, and especially in our encounters between sort of like when we negotiate the encounter between private and public, we need masks, right? We put on makeup or we put on a hat or whatever. Those fall away when we become politically active. Now, this political experience, she says, is getting increasingly lost in our age, right? We've basically done everything, or not us, but the system that we live in has done everything to keep us from making that experience, right? Politics has become a professional business that you need to be a lawyer for to participate in, right? And obviously that's not, thankfully, that's not completely true. But because we live in a society of laborers where we're all forced more or less to sell our labor, we are increasingly barred or feel unable to participate in the political process. And we also feel sort of like at a loss as to why we should participate, right? What is it good for, right? Even voting seems like a burden. So Arendt argues that this is so very hard for us to grasp, this political experience, because we've been trained to think about politics as rule and sovereignty for such a long time. I want to give you a quote from the essay, What is Freedom? Or no. Oh yeah, here. Here she says, yet it is precisely this coincidence of politics and freedom which we cannot take for granted in the light of our present political experience. The rise of totalitarianism, its claim to having subordinated all spheres of life to the demands of politics, and its consistent non-recognition of civil rights, above all the rights of privacy and the right to freedom from politics, makes us doubt not only the coincidence of politics and freedom, but their very compatibility. We are inclined to believe that freedom begins where politics ends, because we have seen that freedom has disappeared when so-called political considerations overrule everything else. Was not the liberal credo, the less politics, the more freedom, right after all? Is it not true that the smaller the space occupied by the political, the larger the domain left to freedom? Indeed, do we not rightly measure the extent of freedom in any given community by the free scope it grants to apparently non-political activities, free economic enterprise, or freedom of teaching, of religion, of cultural and intellectual activities? Is it not true, as we all somehow believe, that politics is compatible with freedom only because and insofar as it guarantees a possible freedom from politics, right? And I think this is the freedom, this is what we mean by freedom very frequently, especially in a US context, right? Which is not to say that this isn't the case in other Western democracies, but this freedom to assume or to think whatever we want, religious freedom, right? These are always highlighted, but these are all also freedom from politics, right? Rather than freedom to politics. So the first moment that I began with, right, the moment from Juneteenth and the demonstration, illustrates our resistance to politics, I think. I mean, it's worthwhile thinking about this speech in other ways too, the ways that I've pointed to sort of like considerations of the moral value of life, right? But there is also this resistance to politics that we tend to fall into when we politically organize, especially in the US. We think of politics as a business, that is, which is better left to professionals. Or as in the case of Trump and Trumpians, we think of politics as a swamp that needs to be drained, right? And replaced with sort of like an efficient strongman or a kind of economic-like system, right? I think what's helpful to understand this kind of resistance to politics in the modern age is what Arendt calls the rise of the social. And this is also in her book, The Human Condition, in the chapter, the public and the private realm. She argues that the social is a kind of third realm that arises from the dissolution in the modern age of the private realm, of the household, and the public realm of the polis, right? So again, you have this trinity of concepts, which I think is very typical for her. You have the private, the public, and then the social realm. And the social realm, she says, did not exist in the Middle Ages. It did not exist in ancient times. But today, in the context of a laboring society, all we have pretty much is the social. So we've dissolved the boundaries between public and private, and instead we have this realm which is concerned with the becoming public of the concerns of life, right? So the very things that the ancients never would have let in the polis and that were considered unpresentable are now the sort of meat of the social, right? And you could think of many like very sort of like easy examples, like the self-exposure of people on Instagram and stuff like that. Those are just the kind of like, the tip of the iceberg. In The Human Condition, she writes, society is the form, oh, sorry, I'll tell you the page number, 46, that is. Society is the form in which the fact of mutual dependence for the sake of life and nothing else assumes public significance, and where the activities connected with sheer survival are permitted to appear in public. So essentially everything in our society, in the social realm, is about labor, right? All of our activities are centered around the laboring process, and we tend to see even personal relationships in the terms of labor. And you'll remember that labor is the activity that's concerned with the sheer maintenance of life, right? So in that sense, what we're doing in society is not living, it's surviving. And when we seek freedom, we seek it in the social sphere today, right? So we seek it in entertainment, in drugs, in vacation, in pleasure, never in politics, right? We don't think of politics as something associated with freedom anymore. And this is the problem that she has with the social, right? The form that corresponds to the rise of the social for Arendt, or in Arendt's analysis, is the nation state. And the nation state, she says, is modeled basically on the household. So the concerns of the nation are treated the way that a paterfamilias, or a family father, would treat the concerns of his wife and his children and his keeping up his household, right? So the entire social system becomes this kind of like social body. Instead of a political process, instead of action, we have these kinds of like regulatory patterns, right? The way that perhaps you're familiar with Michel Foucault speaks of biopolitics, right? This is really what's sort of like part of Foucault's thinking here too. For Hannah Arendt, the basic experience of this kind of community is loneliness. Because in a society where everybody is isolated in their pursuit of labor, the common world ceases to exist. And I'll give you another quote from The Human Condition for this. It's page 52 at the bottom. She writes, "The public realm as the common world gathers us together and yet prevents our falling over each other, so to speak. What makes mass society so difficult to bear is not the number of people involved, or at least not primarily, but the fact that the world between them has lost its power to gather them together, to relate and to separate them. The weirdness of this situation resembles a spiritualistic seance where a number of people gathered around a table might suddenly, through some magic trick, see the table vanish from their midst, so that two persons sitting opposite each other were no longer separated, but also would be entirely unrelated to each other by anything tangible," right? So she says, we've taken the bottom out of relations. We no longer relate to each other through the political. We exist side by side as isolated laborers. When Hannah Arendt says that plurality is the condition of action, she means exactly this, the separation and the commonality, right? So the table metaphor in the spiritualistic seance is about this duality of equality and distinction. So meaning that we are gathered together in action, but we're not on top of one another, right? In the action chapter, which you read of The Human Condition, Arendt likens our participation in politics to a second birth. This is on page 176. And in this second birth, by which she means that we come into the world as babies, obviously, but we also come into the world in the sense that there's a place for us, right? We're initiated into speech and action by others around us. So each person actualizes their capacity in this second birth. And politics is that phenomenon in which we become who we are. And this is her whole idea about the who, which is really the emphasis, I think, crucially here, is not on a who of personality or showing yourself and how great you are, right? Or showing your character, but that a who shows itself to and in the company of others, right? So you become someone only in the company of others. And that someone might not even be transparent to you, right? You might not be able to know who you are. So I think what's interesting here is that her account is always directed to the presence of others and to the tension between difference and sameness. So even when she discusses how politics is about the singular act, she immediately qualifies this by stating that history has no authors. Another important quality of action, also in the context of the current political moment, is that by founding institutions, action also, quote, creates the conditions for remembrance, that is, for history. So what we do in private and on the job fades away, right? But what we do in political bodies, the kind of foundation that we create when we create a political structure, such as, for instance, the Dismantle the Police initiative in Minneapolis currently, these kinds of things institutionalize memories, the memories of an act specifically. And this is why action is called a miracle by Hannah Arendt, right? This is not about a religious dimension, but about the fact that a miracle interrupts the sort of like seamlessly endless, repetitive, natural processes. A miracle is the thing that sort of like interrupts those processes and creates something new. So all of this, I think, I want to sum up relatively quickly because I'm running out of time and I've talked your ear off, I'm sure. This leaves us with the question of political thinking. So if it is true that there is a certain antagonism on the one hand between professional thinking, so philosophy, and action, as she has said, and on the other between the experience of freedom and thought, then how can we think action is the question. How can we think politically, in other words? And I think that the answer to this question lies in the very idea of plurality. In order to think action, we have to think plurally, and we have to think plurality. In other words, to go back to the second moment that I started the presentation with, we have to think non-tyrannically. As you all know, if you've reviewed some of the philosophical tradition, the traditional political philosophy begins from the self and the self-sense, der Selbstsinn, as reason, right? So philosophy traditionally begins with the singular philosopher, the mind of the philosopher and his ability to reason. And this kind of like concentration on the individual philosopher and his reason develops, according to Arendt, a coercive logic. The earliest example that she might give us for this is Plato, who discovers the ideals through his superior reasoning, right? So through this process of the dialogue with Socrates and others, Socrates demonstrates for us that through his reasoning, he can find these everlasting ideas, which are inaccessible in any other way, right? They're sort of like these very removed divine structures. Against this kind of like superiority of reason, which according to her develops a coercive logic, she posits with Kant that we start with the world sense. And the world sense is that sense which grows from being with others. And the way that it articulates itself is in public spirit and in the imagination, right? So we need both public spirit and the imagination to develop a sense of the world, or as she says, world sense. So to think politically is to participate in politics and to think with others, very simply, right? But it also means that we try to grasp acts, not agents, when we write and think about politics. Acts, not agents. When we focus not on the individual hero of an action, but on the complex web around an act, let's say. Similarly, we concentrate on relations and not on states, right? So not on the sort of like singular capacity of a thing, but on the relationships between people, organizations, historical events. And we concentrate on interruptions and not on processes, right? So we in writing and thinking about politics, we still need to be aware of the processes that are going on, but we have to pay special attention if we want to activate the potential of political thinking to things that interrupt the flow of history, if you will. The category of imagination is crucial here, and I want to encourage you to see Arendt's many literary examples that go from Homer all the way to Kafka, not as illustrations, but as a model for a way of thinking which does not create uniform meaning. Instead, this kind of like these poetic examples show a way of thinking as relating things without subsuming one to the other. Right? So if you think of the way that a poem works, there's not one hierarchical meaning and then all the other sort of like sub-statements, but all of the different parts of a poem are in a kind of harmony, if you will, right? None of them are less important than the other, and if you take one out, you lose the poem. So this is the kind of model that I want to leave you with as a model for political thinking. And this is also, to close with one of Arendt's favorite writers, Bertolt Brecht, the communist German writer. It's a poetic model for a world in which everyone is equally visible. All right, so that was exactly 1 hour. I'm very proud of myself. And the way I would envision the discussion is that maybe we could discuss what you got out of the text in relation to the lecture, instead of only asking questions to me, right? Like I would prefer if we develop a discussion of the understandings that you've gathered from the text, rather than a sort of like Q&A where you shoot and I answer.
Okay, that sounds fine for me. Yeah, there are some questions. I haven't opened up the Q&A yet, but we'll see what we have. We've got Rick. If anybody would like to speak, raise your hand in the chat room and I will get you on here. I don't mind if anybody wants to talk about what they got out of the reading or what they have reflected on over the last hour. Let's start with Rick. Rick, hello.
Okay, hello guys. So it seems what she's doing here, this idea of action.
For instance, like,
Oh, I'm sorry, is it on me? What she's doing here with this idea of action is action in a simple sense is like me doing stuff, but it's not like me running around the block. That's not action. It's not the kind of action she's interested in. The action she's interested in is only like us coming together or people coming together. And that intrasocial element, you mentioned in the very beginning, this idea of like this web, you know, if we're all connected. So action is going to disrupt, or I should say modify that web, right? If I do something in a group of other people, that interconnection is going to become modified and go off and do something else, which seems to be what's important for Arendt. So in that case, to her then, politics, which of course isn't legislating, politics is creating the space that allows that to happen. That's what politics is. In a certain sense, David getting you to talk to us and putting this meet up here, in a certain sense, that's what's political. It's creating a space so that people can come and show who they are, not what they are, and who they are. But through doing that, what's important is that it changes the whole social nexus. It seems to be that's what's important, the idea of change. So if you think of politics of this idea of conserving, well, skip that word, this idea of preserving the nexus, you know, that's bad, 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 bad. It has to allow this openness for change to happen. And that's why to her, freedom becomes then in this political realm, freedom becomes making promises. That's action. It's committing to something which is changing, you know, changing the whole network, which is interesting because then that becomes a miracle because you're changing the material factor that's there. So in a certain sense, miracles don't happen anymore. Miracles happen all the time. If I say, honey, I'll meet you tomorrow, that's a miracle because I'm declaring that I shall change the material structure of what shall be, kind of thing. So politics then is what allows that to happen. Then the other important part of the equation, I find it interesting you didn't go there, is this idea of forgiveness, which I think is like really, really awesome because I've never seen any other philosopher pick up that idea. But this idea of forgiveness is also a miracle in that it breaks the causal change. Because if I make a commitment, I make a promise, and I affect the social nexus, oops, something might go awry. But with the idea of forgiveness, you can change that and shift that and go by and let new things coming out all over again. So in a certain sense, to her, birth isn't just giving birth to children. Birth is making a promise. It's committing to something. It's saying, I shall do something. In a certain sense, that's the natality that she's so interested in. But you have to be able to undo that. And I think that's what makes this whole philosophical political idea so darn interesting. And I also like the way, one other last thing, and I'll shut up, is the way that politics was great until the Greeks started thinking about it, or until the philosophers got their hands on it. As soon as the philosophers got their hands on it, everything started going downhill. And I just find that an intriguing thing. I just kind of like the way she does that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I just love that, making promises and forgiveness, putting those two together, creating a space for everything, whoosh, do that, and everything's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, what we're doing here, I agree, is political, although I think we would have to make the space even more open, right? So we're still right now in this sort of like semi-private arrangement of, you know, whoever wants in can come in, right? In order to sort of like really make this a political space, we would have to think about, you know, how do we meet in a way that this is actually open to people who are not implicitly invited or who didn't, you know, participate in this app or whatever. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's because David didn't send out the link to everybody. David only sent out the link to people that signed up. So blame it on him.
That's great. Okay, Rick, thanks very much. We got a few more. Let's go for David again. Hey, David.
Hi, can you hear me there?
I can hear you.
Okay, so I just wanted to go back to something you mentioned at the beginning, which was about your personal experience and the question of a political versus a moral issue.
Mm.
Yeah. I thought she really tied that up at the end of the section you told us to read, when she talked about there being individual political and cultural norms and mores that apply, but they change, they come and go over time. But there is something else. There is something, and this is a little Kantian maybe, a fundamental moral realm that doesn't change and move around. And it's this underlying principle that we're committed. She called it a will to live together, right? So that puts something outside of just politically founded, but really sort of almost objectively. So I hear someone declaring a moral issue, making an appeal to that level. Does that make sense? You're nodding your head.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Great.
Yeah, I really like your way of reframing this issue of the morality of the protests. Yeah, I think that's also, instead of thinking about it as like a resistance to politics,
Right.
we could also think about it in these terms of the question of principle that she highlights, like what basic fundamental principle do our actions embody, right? And this question of sort of like underlying morality of.
Well, it's sort of allowing your action or the group that you're in to act in a bigger polis, which is not so temporally bound to where you are, but saying humanity is a project and we're acting inside that polis because this is a universal. It's something that, you know, any group would understand what we're doing. Our action means this. So it's saying, just, you know, pass a good law because that helps somebody. It's actually a bigger issue. It's about being moral. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I thought.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I also made, like, when I was thinking about this issue of Black Lives Matter movement and the climate movement, I also kept thinking about this sort of like the protection of life, right? That which in both movements is central, right? In one movement, it's Black lives that are to be protected and included, and in the other, it's the life of the planet, basically. And I think that like we could easily sort of like a kind of like maybe simplistic interpretation of Hannah Arendt would say, these are anti-political movements because they center around life, right? Life is on the side of the private, and it's on the side of the sort of like biological maintenance, right? But I think that would, I totally agree with you, and I want to add to that, that would be short-sighted, because the aim of these movements doesn't stop at life, obviously, right? Black Lives Matter seeks equality of Black people so that they can actually do more than survive, right? That they can actually live in the United States. And at the same time, a movement like that seeks to transform the political space from the ground up through the inclusion of people who haven't been previously included, right? So in that way, I wholeheartedly agree with you and think that it's a lot more complex than just separating out, you know, these questions of like life, morality versus politics.
Right, well, I'll throw one more piece. Should I throw in one more piece? I lost it. Yeah. So one other thing was she brought up the issue of technology, there being a sort of threat that when we master the physical world, that kind of mastery is not the same kind of action that we're talking about. But her model sort of fails me at that point, because when you act in the physical world, there's nowhere to go for forgiveness to undo your action. If you've destroyed the actual climate, there's no undo. So there's no process of forgiveness. So, you know, this puts a new level. She's you know, talking about anticipating the threat that humanity can commit actions that could be ultimate and destructive. At least she's foreseeing that. So anyway.
And part of the problem is that these decisions on the political level are not subject to action, right? They like, no one democratically decided to drop a bomb on Japan, right? Like, not that would make it better, right? But the point is, these are technocratic sort of like processes that once started are very hard to oversee, in a similar way to the horrendous actions of the CIA, right? Since basically during Arendt's time, right? So there is, if we hand over these kinds of decisions to non-political agents, then, as she says, we have to live with the murderous consequences.
And the consequences of using plastics are something that no individual is making, but we can see the consequences. You know, and it's, again, like you said, well, there was someone who decided to drop a bomb, but there was really no one who decided what the plastics would be doing. And in all these cases, she's talked about the infinite, unexpected, unintended consequences, and then we have to some way find a redemption, or, you know, a forgiveness or undoing for that. So anyway.
Yeah.
Again, thanks a lot.
There are cases, she goes into this a little bit more. For instance, like, one of the major cases would certainly be the atom bomb, but also the Holocaust, right? There are limits to forgiveness. And those are the cases, those are the events that basically should not have happened, right? So she opens a distinction here between actions that can be forgiven and those that are unforgivable.
Yes, very important point. Okay, great, David, thank you. Let's try to get through as many as we can. We're getting a lot of people here. Okay, how about for Alex now? Okay, Alex, are you there?
Great, thanks, David. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Hi, Jana, thank you for your presentation. It's a real treat. And it's really good to, well, for me personally, to have an occasion to read some of Hannah Arendt. I hadn't really read anything by her before. What I really find fascinating is that it seems like she is a phenomenologist and has a phenomenological method, and yet she is writing about moral and ethical concepts, like others have said. And that's, as far as I can see, that's pretty rare in the phenomenological tradition. And you know, you look at sort of the leading figures, Heidegger, Sartre, Merleau-Ponty, those you know, notions like forgiveness or promising don't really come up in that tradition very much. So I guess what I'm thinking, though, in terms of the question that you asked, I think it was the first one about the current political situation. I wonder if maybe what we're looking at is two different, or at least two, different definitions of politics, rather than maybe, you know, a kind of political fringe and then a sort of apolitical majority. And what I'm thinking is, you know, there's that other definition going back to earlier, you know, Carl Schmidt and that whole tradition that defines politics in a very different way from plurality, right? So politics is about a friend-enemy distinction. It's about a kind of, you know, a kind of polemic, a kind of battle. And what I find interesting also is looking back to the Greeks. I think that was actually a very deep, kind of deeply entrenched understanding that the Greeks also had. You know, thinking, for example, of, I mean, the Trojan War was sort of a defining event for Greek identity, right? And I guess my worry is, and maybe this is a kind of a question to raise, does Arendt have categories to make sense of that kind of experience? You know, the experience of a group defining themselves by virtue of their enemies or by virtue of a kind of struggle, existential struggle. And I think the reason why it's important to raise that is that we see that in the world. And so if that goes unnoticed or kind of unspoken, then there are the dangers of, I mean, I think essentially that's what happened with Weimar and with, you know, pre-war Europe, a kind of, just a kind of refusal to pay attention, that this is actually a real part of human experience, and that people, I guess, kind of crave a totality. You know, people crave struggle, and, you know, for various reasons. I mean, that maybe opens up the possibility for courage, right? The possibility for dying for a worthwhile cause. And so, I mean, I guess it's a big issue, but I would suggest, I guess, that political thinking has something to do with being able to keep both perspectives in mind somehow, and being able to sort of take that plurality and the sort of appearing together in common, and, you know, that she is describing, and somehow, you know, not alienate that from this other aspect, which I think is also very real.
I mean, you know, her political thinking is often called agonistic because the way that she envisions the actual political sphere is not as like a Sunday bake sale, right? There is intense conflict, and there is in the Greek polis too. There is intense disagreement, but the sort of like underlying structure, which is the public space, cannot be called into question, right? So you cannot exclude certain others based on their background or whatever, their ethnicity, from the political sphere if you commit to this ideal of a public space. You cannot see your political opponents as enemies in the sense that, you know, you'll persecute them or you'll punish them for their opinions, right? So there has to be a basis for strife, basically, a basis for, even for your sort of like most intense disagreements, they have to have this basis of the public space. But I don't know if that answers your question. How about a question from a non-male person? I don't want to make any assumptions about the gender of questioners so far, but it seems to me that there is a We're heavy
yeah.
on the male side.
I'm not sure how many we've got actually. I know we do have a few. We do have.
Yeah, we have some women.
So let's yeah, if anybody wants to. Let's see, Alistair next. Okay. There you go.
Can the audio good?
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, my apologies. I mean, I know you're asking for female employees. Hopefully, someone will represent. But my first comment, since you asked, what are you getting reading and from hearing you talk, is that I think it's interesting that she says that you can't be outside of society, outside of the public sphere. You might be doing things, right? You might be having some kind of function or job that you do, but you don't become something until you're part of society. You join that public space. So that public space is kind of the only opportunity where you get to become something, where your identity is crystallized. And if that's the case, then involvement in polity is not just something that's recommended, but is kind of sensibly the only thing that makes sense in order to nourish our well-being, right? Is that what Arendt is asserting here? And if so, it has a lot of implication. If so, it has a lot. It's radical. It's very radical, and it has a lot of implication. Not only in terms of individual well-being, right, but also produces this wide-ranging effect in that metaphysics and ethics, right? Beyond just politics, like just ethics in general. I personally, I don't buy into it completely. But I think the point here is very worth considering, because I think that currently today we view this idea as your personal identity is something that you craft yourself. To the extreme end, maybe you craft in complete isolation, right? You sit in your room or something like that, you read a book, and or you read a Bible, right? And your identity is just between you and God, for example. I mean, that's one extreme end. And then, but Arendt is saying on the other end, no, you're not actually anything. You might be reading stuff, you might be comprehending stuff, you might be analyzing stuff, but you're not anything until you come to the public sphere and you either do things for other people or with other people, that you can then have an identity, right? Something more concrete that you feel. I think your example of being involved in a political kind of activities, I can sort of relate to that, But I don't necessarily agree with completely, but I think it's worth considering. It's a radical thought. It's worth considering. The second thing here is I'm not sure, and maybe you have an answer. I'm not sure you can do away with the thoughts that politics, right? Not polity, but politics, at the end of the day, is a zero-sum game. We can craft. There's a lot of space to craft the narratives, right, about what's possible, what we should do, and so forth. And that's not a zero-sum game. But once you start taking action and say, I need to bring my narrative, I need to bring my vision into material fruition, right? The thing about material fruition is that the material world is limited. It is a zero-sum game, at least in intermediate time frame, right? Long term, you can always expand the production frontier, but in the immediate term, resources are always limited. So when we say, so I think politics at some point is a zero-sum game. It has become a battle of might. I hate to say it, but at some point it becomes a point where might makes right, where the force with the most people with the most guns gets to define what needs to be done with the resources. And the resource question is important, right? Because you can't make this narrative if it's just in your head. You have to bring it into material fruition. Right? So I think at some point, if you take our argument to its natural conclusion, I think eventually it will come to a point of might does make right. That Plato, right, and his idea of instrumentation does start to kick in, I think. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. Like, can we really do away with it? I think there has to be a point where, that stuff definitely does kick in. I think you need both.
I mean, she has this great little book called On Violence that might help you think through these issues. One of the points she makes there is that violence will never create power. It'll only ever diminish power, right? So this idea of like might makes right may work in the short run, right? But in the long run, she says, if you rely on violence for achieving political ends, you're going to diminish power, right? And she draws on a long tradition of other thinkers there, like Montesquieu and many others who've pointed to this.
Right. So you're right. So violence is an act where you're harvesting, right? You're extracting your political power. You're exercising it. You're discharging, right? Political power. You're not building it up. So if you keep doing it, you will eventually, deplete your resources. But it has to be exercised at some point when it comes into contact with the material world. You have to exercise it. And at the point of exercise, at the point of discharge of political power, it is a zero-sum game of conflict. And then there's a continuous thing you have to do in the background, right? Where you have to continuously build it up as well. So you cannot just like discharge, right? And fight. You have to also build up political power. But that point of discharge does happen, right? That point of exercise does happen. So all these activities that the CIA does and all these kind of political, pushing down your throat of ideology, we don't like it. I don't like it. But nonetheless, at some point, it actually becomes a political necessity. Because otherwise, we can't bring things into fruition, right?
I don't know. I mean, I don't think that any of these things are necessary, right? They may become necessary within the logic of the system, but that's exactly the danger of not opening politics to what she calls action, but making decisions based on sort of bureaucratic, internal, where do we need to spend the money? How much, how do we estimate, what the Iraqis are going to do, and all of these calculations that are done by so-called experts, right? Instead of, the last couple of wars that the U.S. has led were not democratically, like they were not, there was no vote for the war. And I'm not saying that it would be better for there to be a vote, because I don't trust the current political leaders of either of these parties when those decisions were made. But I think it is significant in terms of, what the kind of massive amounts of power that we've handed over to government structures that are not accountable to anyone.
Right. I agree. And I think it's good to reflect on a wide range of thought tradition, because what she brings here is, again, it's a reminder that we need to broaden the scope of involvement. Right? We need to mix politics. What I really welcome here is that she make the polity the business of everyone, right? Not just the business of the elite or the know-how, but the business of everyone who have a stake interest in humanity. I think that's a welcoming thought to have. And I think we should all rise to that message. But I hesitate in kind of saying we don't need the other part, right? I hesitate to say that we don't need the other part where we have to come to conflict with each other. I do think you need both. At some point, the tip of the spear has to touch something. And we don't like it. I don't like it, but it happens. For me, it's a point of personal tension. I continuously have to resolve, right? Like, how do I balance between being open and exploring, and then at the same time, I have to know where to draw the line and say, okay, this is what needs to be done, right? And this is the extent to which I'm willing to go, right? This is the amount of sacrifice I'm willing to go to get it done. Which I know is a distasteful thing to say, because it comes to the point of, to make an omelet, you got to break eggs. But at some point, you got to be admit and say, what am I willing to break? what am I willing to break? Because you're not willing to break anything. You can't.
Well,
change
anything, right? Because you need if you need the omelet, then you break all the eggs you have, right?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate. Yeah, it's an
a very
unfortunate
difficult
state.
proposition.
That's right.
You care about the eggs. You know?
That's right. It's a difficult mindset to be in. It's a difficult thing to be in. But once you're there, you have to make a decision. And you may not like it. You may not like it. I'm not there yet, but what I fully expect that when I'm there, I might not like what I decide.
Well, but then wouldn't it be better not to make politics a means ends question?
I would like that. I would like that. I personally do. But like I said, to bring ideas into fruition, to bring these narratives into fruition, it has to come in contact with the material world. And the material world, at least in intermediate terms, is limited. That's sort of the human struggle. That is sort of the human struggle. I have to confront that reality as well. Right? To the extent that I have the material resources where I'm not forced to confront the boundaries of where the limits are. When I'm not at the boundaries yet, I can say, I'm free to do all kinds of things. But once I'm there, I got to pull the trigger.
Well, I don't think that the resources are limited insofar as that, like, action, the resources of beginning are not limited. They are, as plural and as plentiful as there are people on the planet, and most people, obviously, they are sort of like resources have not been consulted in
that's right. I agree.
processes that we have currently. There's an interesting discussion going on in the chat about forgiveness, and I was wondering if perhaps Kate would like to speak to the question of forgiveness, or what you're discussing, or maybe Christine.
Yeah, thanks for your comment,
Yeah, thank you,
Alistair. I think, sure, if Kate, could you raise your hand? I'll get you on. There's a lot of people who are raising their hands. So that's the best way. Oh yeah, I'll do that. Okay. All right, Kate.
Okay, hi. Am I okay? Hello. Yeah, so you wanted me to speak to forgiveness or an action and
I was just wondering what your discussion has been about.
Yeah, so I think it started in the theological realm with regard to Judas. Somebody had mentioned Jesus prayed that his Father would forgive sinners, and then somebody was asking those who crucified him, and then somebody was asking whether Judas was forgiven, and so we were having a discussion about whether that happened. Jesus did say that it would be better for him if he had never been born, but that actually draws on Old Testament phrasing, which doesn't necessarily have to do with hell. It just means that his experience of his life became totally wretched. So that's sort of that's a theological Old Testament deal. And then it came back to Arendt, and we were talking about forgiveness versus justice, and if the two are sort of divorced from each other. I don't think they are. I mean, forgiveness actually does preserve the capacity to act, to engage in action, to have the natality, to engage in new beginnings. You are sort of breaking the chain of cause and effect of like action, reaction, which would really sort of, I'd actually almost bring it back into the natural realm as opposed to like the creative political realm where you can act plurally. But anyway, it's about sort of preserving natality, preserving new beginnings. But she does also say, I don't think we've gotten to this, but she does say there are certain things that are unforgivable because they're outside of the human realm. And I do think it's important to keep that too. That's not something that shows up in Christian scripture, but it is definitely something that applies to like something like the Holocaust. I mean, it's just so monstrous. How is it something that a human being could forgive? And she doesn't say that it's not necessarily forgivable from God's perspective, but it is sort of outside human action, outside the human realm. And so not really, she sort of connects it to Kant's notion of radical evil. It's just beyond the human sphere. So it's sort of in the divine sphere. We don't really know what will happen. It's sort of like the question of Judas. We don't really know what's going on there, but it is horrifying and kind of beyond our capacity to forgive.
Yeah, I mean, the question of justice is so interesting in her work, I think, because she's not really a thinker of justice as we understand it today, right? Like a lot of contemporary theoretical political thought is concerned with this question of justice, right? And sort of like the justice and the connection to equality. And her question, her thinking touches on issues of justice when she, for instance, in the essays on morality and responsibility after the Second World War, she touches on this question, or in the famous Eichmann book, right? She, at the end of the book, she repeats the sentence, the judgment on Eichmann. But the interesting thing is that she frames this question of of justice, sorry, in the terms of judgment. So
that's right, Kant, yeah.
Yeah, Kant. So she's not talking about social justice. That is sort of like that is not an Arendtian concept, I think. But she is talking about problems related to judgment.
Yeah, and for her, I think it's more of like an aesthetic sense. It's it has to do with that shared reality and that shared realm of the political, and almost a sense of taste, I think.
Exactly. So judgment and common sense are both sort of like faculties that locate us in the world. And so is forgiveness, right? So it's always in some way her concepts always relate back to this idea of reconciliation with the world.
And I think preserving new beginnings, natality, because she saw how locked down things could become with totalitarianism. That's part of her, like her aversion to logic and just sort of this rigorous, straitjacketed, not aversion to it, but the calling it tyrannical. And so she wants to open up that space of freedom. I think another element of justice for her would be sort of the isonomia, like the equality before the law. And so that's a big social justice issue, though. I mean, it often doesn't really called that way, but that's a very big Greek concept, the idea that like everybody is equal before the law and has an equal vote. And that's actually part of the plurality and difference, is that we're all different, but we're all equal and can act equally. So that's also a justice aspect, but definitely a little bit different from the social justice.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Certainly. Let's go on to, let's try to get everybody as we can. How about Frank? Is Frank there?
I'm here. Thank you.
Go ahead, Frank.
I wanted to address the matter of originality in the political debate process. I think one of her concepts is that when we enter into discussion, we discover ourselves, yes, but we discover something original and unique, something we were born with, so to speak, that needs to come forth as expression. And I find that very interesting in this context. When you enter into usual discussion on something like racism, you quickly hit certain dead ends. That is, people are not very original in their thinking on the subject of racism, which may be why we repeat racist activities in our society. And this most recent George Floyd matter invites us to go deeper into more original thought, which I think that Arendt would invite and really define as political thinking. What is politics, you asked in the beginning? And it might be an invitation to engage in original thinking with one another. So if I had, an observation, it is, I do not necessarily want to enter into a neighborhood town hall meeting in which we hear the same old, tired statements from unoriginal thinkers. I don't know where that gets us. It certainly doesn't seem to move us past the problem of racism in our society. There needs to be some radical new thinking. How do we accomplish that in these town hall meetings? I've heard people say, for example, we invite anyone into the polis. There must be space for this creative expression. How do we create that originality that we want? How do we invite that originality? How do we foster that originality to make it possible to have the politics that she wants in the world?
I think that's a great question. Did anyone want to answer to that, speak to that?
Yeah, if anybody has an immediate response to that, tell me in the chat and I'll unmute you. How about Shadi?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Nice hearing you all, especially sorry. Hello to Rick. We read this book together many years ago. So it's good to hear him talking about this big book again. But to mentioning about the current issues, if I want to say an example of a minority whose voice has never been heard in mainstream media in the US, is I'm Iranian. So it's good to give a safe space. The main thing is, if people feel discriminated, if the people feel the existing narrative in the society is not accurate and they're not given their rights, it's important to have, the first step is to give them safe space. This is something that is not given to many people in their work environment or in their social environment. What I read in Arendt, a lot of explanation regarding the action that she's talking about is basically social engagement. The thing is, people who don't have power, they're coming from less power and they're already in less power and under power. And for me personally, has always been some white people supporting me that has empowered me. So it's important to understand that people who are being discriminated and are in difficult circumstances, it's hard for them to be discriminated and also fight. It's important to give them power through people who have power and who are in a safer environment to support them and give them voice. And that's the first step. And this is what I hear a lot about from Black people in America too, because a lot of Black people are not talking about, and I'm talking about people who are in higher level of economical class of society, that they're those people who were even quiet about what they were going through during their life. But right now they feel that they can breathe and they can talk about it because they're ashamed of saying all those things that they were going through. So I think that's something that I can add. And also I had a question regarding the book, but I feel like there are so many people in here who wanted to talk. So I don't want to take people's time. Maybe
No, please ask.
I'll remember, Shadi, and I'll get to you. There's a couple of people I think want to speak to the immediate.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
let's bring up Rick first. Okay, Rick.
Okay, I'll just say this really quick. But first, hi, Shadi. Sorry, David and Jen. I just had to say that. But getting back to the question that was posed, like I forget who asked it, but the idea that how do we get away from this town hall? We go in here and just hear the same junk all the time. But I think part of it is get more people to go to the town hall. But also, I think what's more important that we don't do is vote locally. People say, I'm going to vote in And I'm going to vote in 2020. Well, it's not just vote in 2020 and then go home and sit for 4 years. Vote for your local alderman, vote for your local whoever, vote for your local, know who, I mean, how many of us even know who our local alderman is? You know, it's not just the, let's do this thing every 4 years and pat ourselves on the back. You got to get involved on the local, down to the nitty gritty, get your hands dirty kind of basis. So that would be my answer about what to do for town halls.
Sure. Let's go with Christine.
Oh, hello. I'm from Melbourne. So hello, it's nice to hear everyone on the other side of the world. I'm going to comment on the town hall originality of ideas point. I think that originality of ideas stems from how well we truly know ourselves. And my general philosophy is that we cannot expect much political or social change if we don't confront ourselves. So I guess it goes to that Jungian concept of the shadow self. I think if we're truly doing that, then we truly become aligned with our own values and we become confronted with ourselves. And I think it would be interesting to see what would happen in greater society if more of us spent time doing that very difficult work on ourselves by ourselves. That's pretty much what I have to say.
Thank you.
Sure. Let's go with Brian. Brian,
Yes, hello.
go ahead.
I just wanted to answer the question, or attempt to answer, give my answer on the question of racism. Very fundamentally, racism is I'm human, you are not. I'm a human being with all the rights and privileges thereof, you're not. And so therefore, I'm going to treat you as such if I'm a racist. And okay, I'll back this up as the rationale. I've lived in Europe. I've lived here in America. I was born and raised here in America. I've lived in Asia, worked in Asia for years. And the definitions of a human being change from context to context and society to society. So after a few years, that's where I came down to basic premises. And the basic premise, at least what I came to realize, was that I'm a human being, you're not. There's racism for you in a nutshell. So
That's exactly right. Yeah. There's a thing we're calling we, and who is included in that we, and who is excluded from that circle. That's
well, especially in Asia, that's a very, very large concept, because Asia is much more about we versus I, and it's a lot more about the collective versus the individual. However, it still gets down to individual questions many times when you're over there. So I'm not going to go off on a million tangents, but in my experience, that's what it comes down to, very simply. I'm human, you're not. And I'll treat you as such.
And when you've eliminated the quality of being human, then you're allowed to do whatever.
Right. Right. I can do whatever, because your Untermenschen or subhuman, or whatever term you want to, gaijin in Japanese, whatever term you want to put on it, there it is. So.
From the way I understood the initial question, which I thought was a really worthwhile question to ask, how do we change this, right? How do we address racism, and why is it so hard to move from these sort of unproductive belly rubbing meetings to actual change, right? And I feel like a number of really amazing points have already been mentioned, and I want to add one, which is that these town hall meetings often have no purpose, right? They often don't have any power. And power, according to Arendt, is an intrinsic part to action. Like if you are only meeting to sort of like exchange views and to sort of like, you know, tell each other how much you hate each other, that's not going to get you anywhere, right? That these meetings actually have to have the power to make decisions. And so in that sense, the step prior to these town halls is that the kind of like important decisions have already been handed over, and now it's just a bunch of people left talking about why things don't change, right? So if you look at what's going on in the current political moment with Black Lives Matter and White Lives for Black Lives and all of these solidarity groups and the efforts to rethink policing in America, those groups have grabbed power that was sort of like, as Arendt would say, lying on the street, right? So those groups have actually claimed some of the power back and have done the impossible, really, which is to say, no, we get to decide what policing in America should look like, right? And that is a sort of radical step that something like a town hall must take if people actually want to have a constructive communication rather than just sort of like, yeah.
All right, thanks for that, Brian. Let's go with Richard. Richard, are you there?
Hi. Hi, thanks very much for the talk. I'm actually soon going to be facilitating a discussion on Hannah Arendt's essay, Truth and Politics, from one of the books that you brought up soon. But I'm still definitely a novice and learning a lot about Arendt's thinking and works. My question kind of goes to something you kind of brought up just very quickly in passing in the beginning, but I think it also touches on some of the questions that were brought up since that, which is just, you know, like what's going on in our current political sphere with Black Lives Matter, and just that, you know, like the need for us to, you know, recognize that Black lives also have value and investment and should be protected and, you know, treated like white lives. I think sort of like what's kind of maybe loaded there is that, and this is something not just, you know, for those who support, you know, Trump and MAGA, but I think also those who, you know, voted, you know, Obama and for, you know, for Clinton, is that it's not possible to give a Black person the same experience that white people have enjoyed, because you cannot at all separate the fact that for many white people, not all, like say, for example, I will include like, you know, those in the Appalachians, which, you know, MLK, you know, called, you know, the part of the other America, you know, the underclass. But for many white Americans, the bourgeois, their experience comes with the fact that they have been superior and they have these privileges above people. And I think part of the reckoning with equality, I think, you know, across the political spectrum, is that to come to terms that giving that up, you know, really means, you know, really means something. I don't quite fully agree with, you know, the idea that politics is fully a zero-sum game. But I think, you know, there is a point in that, you know, like there is so much inequality right now, the state of things, and where, you know, resources and capital have been, you know, hoarded by, you know, like by a small number in power. So that does kind of have to come to a head in some way. And then just also kind of against a backdrop of not only necessarily is the pie not getting bigger, but we have to consider that the pie will contract, you know, in this world of climate change. You know, I'm kind of thinking of Greta Thunberg's, you know, impassioned speech, you know, like these fantasies of eternal economic growth. And I think, you know, definitely the answer doesn't lie in in that kind of neoliberal agenda that will just kind of grow our ways for all of us to be prosperity, like in this current, capitalist system, which, actually binds and represses all of, like so many of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So wait, what was the question? Sorry.
I think kind of the key point is that, like, sometimes like the nice things we tell ourselves, or just the idea of like like the discussion about equality over the past few decades, at least, like that I've been alive, it's I wouldn't say it's maliciously disingenuous, or I think it doesn't quite factor in that Black people and people of these repressed classes gaining equality. Trying to rephrase here. Like
that we have to give something up, you mean?
Like giving up a sense that feeling superior to someone else. So Plato has this idea of, thumos or thymos, like the human desire for recognition, and a modern thinker, Francis Fukuyama, who I think was kind of disastrously wrong in terms of his coining of the end of history when the Berlin Wall. I'm not going to that tangent, but he did kind of interestingly coin these these ideas, megalothymia and isothymia, where megalothymia refers to the need to be recognized as superior to others, and isothymia is the need to be recognized as merely equal to others. I'm just reading off of Wikipedia here, and I think for those who are, repressed in this white supremacy structure, like they're just looking to be recognized as human, right? But I think for those, not just those who wear MAGA hats, but I think, like that is kind of a little bit at loggerheads with those who have enjoyed megalothymia, like just like the knowledge that within this power structure that they are superior and they have power over others, and like others merely gaining equality does, affect that.
I mean, I find the idea relatively convincing that like part of the sort of like as a substitute for actual equality, right? People are given this idea of superiority, right? This sounds a bit off, right? But what I meant to say was that white supremacy is also a way of making people feel superior who have no reason otherwise to believe themselves superior because they are economically at the bottom of the ladder, right? So yes, there is a way in which sort of like white supremacy maintains the system of sort of like of fake superiority just based on the virtue of your color, right? I think there are two things in what you're saying. One is sort of saying, in order for Black Americans to actually be sort of like be not only given the rights, which they have, but to be made good on the rights, right? The rights, including the sort of like capitalist promise of prosperity, right? Centrally. For that to happen, white people have to give something up, certainly, right? And they have to give up concretely this idea of superiority, which works its way into all kinds of sort of like everyday interactions, right?
Exactly.
But it also has to obviously, like, once systematic racism is addressed, then people will have to give up privileges like immediately being admitted to the school that you wanted to go to, et cetera, right? Like, yes, those things have to be given up. And then there's another idea of sort of like the limitedness of resources, which has come up multiple times here, right? But I think that's why anti-racist and anti-capitalist struggle are linked oftentimes in the current political movements, right? Because the idea is not that everybody attains the status of sort of like a white bourgeois kind of like suburban, whatever, Subaru driving doctor, but that we have to also think about, alongside the systems of racism, we also have to think about how racism is baked into the economic structures, right? And that means economic reorganization, redistribution, right? And that is not, I don't think that's as crazy as it sounds. You know, that could be something like rent control, right? Pressing for rent control locally, which, you know, is very much an achievable and attainable goal.
All right, thanks very much, Richard. I think we're gonna have to go with Anita next. I'm gonna promote you to panelist. Okay, Anita, if you can, turn everything on, go. You're not muted. Can't hear you.
Maybe you have to unmute her.
Oh, do I have to? I'm the guy who has to.
Because it has that little red symbol.
Oh, okay, panelists. So if I do that, chat, it just says ask to unmute. I'm pressing it, ask to unmute. Ask to unmute.
Ah, here we
And
go.
I actually
There.
also had to respond. Okay, cool. That's an interesting theme. It's this interactivity, you know, of the collective that I'm kind of focusing on. And we end up getting this goal we're looking at of this, you know, active action sort of space that Arendt has as this ideal or goal. It's totally possible. I don't think it's just theoretical, but it occurs because of each situation provides for it. It's so unique. Every historical moment has all these ingredients that really can be seen as a complex system. There's everything pertinent about the actual environment and the politics of that particular time and what's in play in state affairs, what just occurred with George Floyd that motivates people, what's their history, what sort of collective sense do they have, as well as individuals. So they're all in a modeling of complex adaptive interaction. We see that we can see many agents with different motivations, different levels of, you know, understandings. Some are going to be more inclined to use their perceived powers. If they are white, for instance, they're in touch with those, and so they're going to exert them. They might have, you know, any number of influences them. So because that is so many actors, when we have a collective, any polis, it becomes unpredictable to see what might happen. And so only when it happens together do we see, for that moment, these actors, this influence, this herd influence, this, you know, clarion call, you know, that speaks to everyone, that motivates them, whether it's, you know, Thomas Paine or Martin Luther King, that brings about some recognition. We can't predict in any moment what might develop. So we have the possibilities of a cooperative society, and we know that association ends up mattering. And if you have enough of a collective, I'll call it a core, you can exert a bigger influence on your group around you, whether it's got social media and it's extended or it's just in that little square and there's no, you know, cameras or videoing, taping of it. And the evolution of collective action, of cooperation has been studied. And when we see, like our group in Tanzania, of what are models of more ancient hunter-gatherer societies that have this idea about true equality. Okay, there's no hierarchy recognized. You're not better than me. We're going to have cooperative action. I was interested in seeing, you know, these studies of the Hadza, of these tribes, and interestingly enough, they exercise. Well, it's almost like a tradition, a circulation in their groups. So for 4 months, 6 months, they're in this cooperative society, and the individuals of them are kind of like this, you know, it's a perfect exemplary, experiment to show that society's been made and how well that cooperation works is made up of the individuals of it. Talk about original, thinking as a contribution to what happens in the in this free polis. It's already always happened. And we can have a development of more or less cooperative societies. So when they interviewed those individual members of Hadza, some were like, yeah, it worked pretty good. I felt really good. And then I went to another one and there was some who used deception, were sneaky, were cheaters in game theory to advantage themselves. And that was maybe known, and you could maybe have some negative sanctions enough to control it more or less. Maybe it didn't work, but you had different outcomes and people formed opinions. I didn't really like that one so much. So I was happy with, in about 4 months, I moved and I joined another little cooperative society. So it sort of illustrated to me, we actually all have that. People get up and move. They join a forums, they join up with this meetup group and they go, oh, I'm going to be with these minds that they're from Melbourne, to anywhere in the world who happen to be here, and we're engaging with each other. So we make up a very far more fluid polis that's self-selecting if we want. And the outcome's not predictable because there are too many possible influences. Nobody can predict. Who can say, oh, it's this person's idea, is that one? And I think we're already always seeing, if we look for it, not just hope for that it'll happen, but we are seeing original thinking. We are seeing impulses. They might be for control, but they might be for problem solving, or let's do this collective action. Yeah. And so I was heartened when I saw these demonstrations after George Floyd going, dang, we can do better than the way this police department's been acting. Let's do, a citizen review of what really policing, action looks like in our community. And they instituted it. And, that was original thinking. That was action, in all the ideal senses. So they're always possible. They're influenced by many more parameters, individual actors, circumstances, the actual environment that we're all acting in that we can't quite necessarily see. And so there's many ways we can look at any particular thing and say counterfactually, what could have happened? Just that extra big sign, or that there was actually somebody who had a video. What if we hadn't had the video of George Floyd? Oh, we all know that's another counterfactual. Would not have gone the direction that it did. Anyway, so I'm bringing us to talk about contributions that we can all make that are original thinking.
Yeah.
This is complex adaptive systems of social systems. We have on hand, way more parameters than we can keep track of. We have tipping points, we have black swan events, we have all the things that we know that can happen in complex systems. And it's a source of my hope. It's my answer to engage as we are right now. I do think that was a great point that we made. And there is no given necessarily outcome. Isn't that wonderful? We as individual actors can make, a difference. So anyway, that's awfully heartening.
Oh, my internet dropped out for a second. Because you blew my mind, I think. I think what I found really cool about what you said is that I think we as scholars also have a responsibility to point to those moments where that's already going on, or where there could be a possibility for that to happen, right? Like to recover moments in history where those models were actually alive, right? About which we learn nothing in like history lessons in school, right? History lessons in school are full of like heroes and presidents and, but these sort of like examples of collaborative societies are not front and center, and we should front and center them.
Yeah, Arendt does. I noticed her talking about in Romania, these, self-organizing little collectives, collectives and forums. When people were saying, how could we make, a better town hall? Well, my answer was, everyone's always been doing this already. There are, outsider artists. There are people graffitiing on the walls. If they're not making a mural, like Riviera, we are affecting each other in other ways than that town hall or in academia writing these papers. People do have their power because they write their poem. They've scribbled it on cave walls from thousands of years ago. Yes, there's many, many, many examples. I was at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. They had a whole exhibit of outsider art. People will be heard. Alex de Tocqueville talked about democracy in America. Oh, he had never, his mind was blown. Like, America's filled with all these forums and associations. We're gathering in, coffee shops, but also beer halls, in little town halls, but in people's homes, back porches. Every group, every oppressed group, every minority group, they've found their voice. They've written their poems. They've written their graffiti. It's out there. We have to have our ears, open and bring them in, like let them flourish, bring them to the light. I think that's a beautiful thing to do. The job of just take notice. Look, it's over here. Look, it's over here. People's over here. Guess what they said over here? And, oppressed, folks of Egypt, when they're building the pyramids, we've been speaking to this issue of power. And one other thought about that, I think that ultimately we survived. It's part of adaptation that we're opportunists. And that's what interferes with, any cooperative society. Is that anybody going to say, well, if I don't have any negative sanctions, I'm going to come back for the hunt and I'm going to tuck away a few rabbits over here under the bushes. And I'll come to my group and say, here, yeah, I'm sharing everything. It's a cooperative society. They got away with what they could. That's how we survive. So we should just look at the conditions that help fan self-seeking behavior, because that's how we, that's part of human nature. And our biases that we recognize something going on when somebody's got a different skin color than we do. And you're 6 months old and something's going on. I mean, they now got a word like implicit biases. I mean, how humans are made cognitively is we have to notice other. What's the signs that they're identified as other? We have fear, and am I going to survive? I have to stay with my group. So groupishness is built into the human condition, and we have to overcome it if we're going to have more collective action. So that's some of my thoughts too. And
thank you. I was wondering if we could invite Shadi to answer the question that she wanted to ask a while ago as a sort of like closing question. Because we're at 6:15 almost. So.
Yeah, right. We do have a number of people. Okay, Shadi, if you want to ask your question, maybe we can get one more after this.
Yeah, my question was about page 216. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
216 of the book. It talks about, it starts from page 215 about the animal laborers definition. And at the end of that first paragraph of 216, it says, in other words, the dividing line between the two is not a matter of extreme social and economical demand, but solely of the proposition of a new form of government. So it talks about, that wasn't clear to me, the shift of like how these engagement in society doesn't become effective in a way that it creates another, seem to be another form of authoritarian system.
So she's talking about working class movements here, and she's asking the question, like, how come like some of the major political movements in the 19th and partly 20th century were working class movements, since she's given this explanation of work as being an activity that's sort of like on the side of the realm of necessity, right? So she's asking, why is it that these people whose major concern in life is work are also the ones that are fueling politics in the 19th century? And she's saying that like there are these sort of like conservative strands of working class movements which simply seek to integrate them into society, like the trade unions. But then she says there in the middle of the page, a distinction appeared only in those rare and yet decisive moments. And during the process of a revolution, it suddenly turned out that these people, if not led by official party programs and ideologies, had their own ideas about the possibilities of democratic government under modern conditions. So this is part of her idea that if you have action, if you practice action, political action, you'll get ideas, right? So the very practice of action encourages you to think about reorganizing society in a way that facilitates the continuation of that process of action, right? So she's saying that counter the sort of like conservative tendencies of the trade unions, these parts of the working class movement were really about sort of like a proposition for a new form of government. Is that what you were wondering about?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I read this so many years ago, but what I really realized, and I feel like about when I feel like about my life in the United States or my life in Australia and in general, the current political atmosphere, I feel like there is a weakness in liberal democratic system, which needs constant political engagement of the citizens. This is kind of its strength and its weakness at the same time, because the liberal democratic system doesn't stay, doesn't persist, doesn't maintain the values if you don't continuously update yourself and your liberal ideas and your liberal values. I mean, what I feel most of the time, you can be born in the most open-minded family, in the most liberal place in the world, but if you are not actively engaging yourself about what's happening around you, that doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean that you are liberal. You're conservative. And that's the weakness of the liberal democracy, because people need to constantly be engaged. And the moment that the large portion of society stop being engaged, and like she says in here, they have their own ideas, and the moment they become stale in their ideas, it's gone. Isn't that true? It can say you cannot have that. I feel like it's impossible to have that lively democratic system that can maintain for a long time.
Absolutely.
Because it's against the nature of people. People don't want to be free. People don't want to be engaged. People don't want to burden themselves.
But I think this also has to do with her critique of this very liberal consumer society, right? Where really like our most important choices on an everyday basis are about what to buy, right? Not what to how to shape the actual conditions of our life. So
you think it's totally related to consumerism and capitalism?
I think that plays a huge role, yeah. In this sort of like complacency that you're describing of the conservative liberals, right? And Hannah Arendt is very much not a liberal for that reason, because she doesn't believe in this sort of individualism of classic liberalism.
Yeah, that I agree that she is not being considered lefty liberal. She is more towards the conservative, but I feel like the spirit of his thoughts, in my mind, are not conservative. It needs a lot of action and a lot of thought and a lot of engagement that I don't usually see in the conservative ideology. But I know that these definitions are just like so fluid, so you cannot tag people, especially every 10 years, they even become different. Well, thank you so much for taking my question and caring to answer.
Yeah, I also wouldn't say that she's a conservative. You know, she didn't recognize those political distinctions for herself. I mean, obviously she knew about liberalism and conservatism and had problems with both, but she didn't consider herself either a conservative or a liberal. And this is also, I think, part of why she continues to be stimulating to us, because she breaks with those classical distinctions, and we have trouble to put her into, you know, there is this matter of the council system and her support for the 1968 student movement and all of these indicators that she's actually a lefty, right? And then there is her insistence on the private versus the political, which would put her into like in some sense, you know, into a conservative framework. But they all exist, you know, they exist in the same woman, and as such, like, they challenge us to rethink what we mean by conservative, what we mean by liberal, and whether those distinctions are meaningful anymore.
Totally. She didn't fit into any sort of definition. Thank you so much.
Sure, Shadi. You know what? We got a few people I just really want to get to. Let's try Sabrina. Are you there, Sabrina?
Hello?
You're on, Sabrina.
Okay.
Or not?
Okay. Hello?
Hi.
Sorry, it seems as though my sound keeps going out. Okay. So I'm happy that Anita spoke right before me, because my question kind of deals with that sort of like multiplicity of groupings and legitimization that she spoke to. That, you know, there are empowered groups, or people do find empowerment within their groups, but I fear that those groups themselves kind of become like little individuals. So if we see these like small communities of groups that are doing their own self-legitimizing, where, you know, each person's humanity within that group is recognized by those members of that group, now we have one sort of like individual group. Does that make sense so far? Mm-hmm. So we have this like small pocket group, and then we end up with a sort of like multiplicity of groups, numerous communities, but only existing in this sort of system where the individual group might not be recognized, or the humanity of that group isn't recognized by other groups. And so we end up with this sort of systemic oppression, systemic and institutional issues across these groups. And so what I agree that there is a lot to be said for the empowerment that's happening among, like, within those groups, and we do get to see like the legitimization of those persons in those small pockets, and maybe over, you know, from a historical lens, we can see that those contributions were made and we can appreciate them for what they were then. We're still existing today in this society where these groups are not being legitimized in any meaningful way. And I want to point to social media as a sort of, I know Hannah Arendt wasn't alive at a time where social media was super prevalent, but we see this sort of like inert space where now these groups are forming, and we're deciding which groups we're wanting to be a part of, and we're speaking and sharing and quote unquote acting in this social media sphere, but we're only being legitimized or heard by people that we want to hear us. And so in an even more tangible way, these communities or these insular groups are being legitimized by themselves and not by the structure outside that's kind of doing the social controlling or what have you. I don't know what conspiracy you abide by, but my point and my question, I guess, is what would Arendt say, or has she written anything about the sort of reconciliation between groups and what can be done to kind of build bridges between groups so that, you know, not just individuals and if you have like two different states now who come into contact with one another, what happens then? And how do we forgive, I guess, a larger group that might have oppressed a smaller group, or how do we move forward so that those groups are being legitimized in a meaningful way and not just by people who care about those groups because they're a part of that group?
It's a really good question. I mean, she wrote a lot about reconciliation, but more in the sense of sort of like reconciliation with the world. So not necessarily sort of like an actual act of reconciliation, though there are moments where she speaks about forgiving her former German friends, you know, for running after the Nazis and so on, including her mentor Heidegger. And then there are the passages about forgiveness in the human condition, right? So which we already touched on a little bit. And I think those would be the passages to turn to. Somebody was bringing up an interesting question in the chat, which was, does the person who, does the person have to ask for forgiveness that is then being forgiven by the other group, right? And those kinds of questions, like, I think work out differently in relation to like inter-community struggles. So if you can still say, oh, here's a recognizable context in which people have some kind of like shared space, right? Then they do in situations where there isn't an actual shared space, right? And then in those situations, I think it becomes really difficult to use her political model. And this gets us, I think, to almost sort of like the limits or where we would have to push her thinking in terms of saying like, what about those groups who are marginal to the political process, who are not already in the polis, right? How do we get those groups to participate in a political process or to be given receive an apology, a meaningful reparation for their suffering, as is being debated right now, right? So this kind of like process of including someone who's not already a part is really a key issue in her thinking and a kind of a limit case of her thinking. So I'd encourage you to like look in the human condition and see if there is a model there for the inclusion of the marginalized, or if in fact her thinking only yields itself to, say, like a mainstream idea of politics.
Yeah, the way I was reading it, I work in civic education. And so I truly believe that her kind of, it spoke so truly to the sort of like her way of thinking, I mean, to the way that communities build trust and how like on a small scale, you can really develop these meaningful relationships where now everyone in this small sort of area is being legitimized and heard. I think somebody earlier mentioned, you know, the validity of local political action, like vote in your local elections, that's where you can make meaningful change. And I think that on the local scale, Arendt's model is valid and it sounds like that's what I want to be a part of. And I just worry about scalability, but I will take your advice and keep reading. This is the first, I really want to thank you all for putting this together because it's the first time that I've kind of dove into her thinking and I do really appreciate it. So I'll be looking for how to scale, you know, this kind of model. Thank you.
Arendt
Cool.
is
Yeah, let me know if you find something interesting, if you want to continue the conversation. My email is, like if you go on the website of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard, you can all find my email and write me if you have any other further comments and questions.
Certainly, certainly. Let's see if we can do George. George, can you, if you'd like? I don't know if George is there. He might have gone away. Let's see about James. How about James Cook?
Can you hear me now?
There you go, James. Go ahead.
All right. So, yeah, I'm just so impressed by the presentation. I just enjoyed it so much. And I haven't read enough, but I do like, really like this idea of local being involved. What rings a big bell with me is this idea of being involved in local politics. The fact that one can get involved with a political party at a local level, and and it's designed, the political system is designed to explode that, to keep exploding that participation. I can become a delegate at a county convention. I can promote myself to be a delegate at the state convention and so on. So this kind of like politics is a little bit like a exciting promotion game, which is aside from the ideology, which of course is the raison d'etre. You know, the reason one wants to get involved in the first place is they think that they might agree with a political platform of a party or a group. I wanted to just mention something that I saw that happened, that I think happened in a kind of like exposes the private sphere. I saw this video, it's on YouTube, of a couple, a black couple, who go to a KOA campsite, and the woman pulls a revolver on them. It looks like a very big gun. And she says, "This is not for you. You get out of here." You know, it's like the worst possible kind of exposure of racism, kind of available probably only to a group that is exclusively black. You know, like maybe people that are, you know, a group that is exclusively black, like a man and wife, could possibly experience something like that from a racist white person, where she confronts both of them with deadly force for having intruded on her life. Then as they're leaving the campsite, the husband is there, and he waves them down and wants to talk to him. And he starts to talk about the amenities at the campsite and why they should turn around and, you know, and enjoy the campsite, you know, because there's such a tremendous campsite. And this reminds me of kind of like an experience I had when I lived in Tennessee for a short time, where I was basically at the Walmart, and there was a woman that was kind of going past me, and with her son in her shopping cart, and she was saying, that's a good guy. That's a bad guy. He's a good guy. You know, so it's like she was like training her son in judgment, which I think probably happens among all races. We all learn something, you know, we have lessons that we learn from specific parents, and sometimes they're exceptional. They're not maybe the lessons we learn from our own parents. As a matter of fact, I learned lessons about self-esteem from my mother that I wish she had not pronounced to me. She said I was better than everyone else. So, you know, those other boys were not like you, you know, and all that stuff, all that, the subject that you touched on in Plato. So that I think this is really what's at stake. I think what goes on in the private sphere, what that woman was thinking when she pulled a gun on people in a campsite where she was, you know, the proprietor, thinking that she was doing the right thing is exactly what controls race relations. Some people are absolutely sure and constantly reinforced by their environment, their immediate environment, on how to think about the world and think about other people, especially other groups in the world. And calling it white supremacism, I think is kind of an excuse. It is a training ritual that goes on in the private sphere. So if you want to know where the evil happens, it happens first in the private sphere. We have to protect the country. We have to protect the family. We have to protect ourselves at any cost. And then it multiplies itself out beyond that through politics, in the case of fascism, case of Nazism, for example. Thank you.
I mean, as for Arendt, she was a relatively an absolutist on this question, which is, she said, we do not have to worry about what goes on in the private sphere of people. And I know that that's a bit startling to hear for us, because we've grown up in the last couple of years with these ideas of social discrimination and microaggression, right, being just a fact. But for her, she, as I said, she's an absolutist. She says, it doesn't matter what you do in your private sphere, what basically, so far as to say what you teach your children, or what your personal beliefs are. What matters is only what goes on in the public sphere. And I think there's one advantage to her thinking, which is that it gets us away from the idea that we have to sort of like do personal work on ourselves, to work on our prejudices, which we certainly can, right? But this sort of call to individual action is very problematic to enforce, right? So, and instead, she says, we have to make certain types of behavior in the public sphere impossible, and we have to punish them, and that includes things like housing discrimination on a level that that has a public dimension, beyond the individual, like, landlord's opinions about whatever brown and black people, right? So this public dimension is what we have to get to, according to her.
So I find that that's just one of the things that I find problematic in the book. Her ideas are sometimes startling, but the fact that they don't sort of make tremendous sense always makes tremendous sense. I think it's very wise to attend a class such as this and become exposed to her ideas, because she wasn't crazy. She was like a very intelligent person. I made a point on the chat that she doesn't seem Heideggerian, really very Heideggerian at all. Sartre was a Heideggerian. That he's somebody who read Heidegger and became a French, kind of like a French version of a Heideggerian thinker. And the Arendt doesn't seem to reflect this title that has been given to her as the of inheriting Heidegger's training. That she doesn't seem to reflect that very much in the book, to me.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think she's a Heideggerian. And I also don't really know if I've read that claim that she's a Heideggerian. But
it was in one of the comments. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Part of the confusion is, I think, that there has not been a good book on the relationship between Arendt and Heidegger. It's sort of like subject to a lot of cheesy speculation about their love, their romantic relationship, but there hasn't really been like a good intellectual account of like his ideas and her ideas and how they relate and depart from one another. Mm.
I've given Kate and Alistair permission. If anybody has a quick saying they want to say. Kate, Alistair.
Let Kate go first.
I'm sorry, with regard to Arendt and Heidegger, or with regard to just public and private space? Sorry.
You have you have the floor.
Okay. Well, Chris Davis has a book on Arendt and Heidegger that's kind of interesting. That gets a bit into their the thought, but it is rather intense. In terms of the public and private space, Anne made an interesting comment. I was thinking, I really like your comment, Jana, about the exclusion of the private space from the public space, and not having to spend all your energy working on yourself, because I do think there's almost like an element of grace there, which I do think gets back to sort of the forgiveness and actually does liberate you towards charity, that action in the public space that is, again, creative and productive, as opposed to sort of locked into the way things are.
Sorry, I missed the beginning of that question because my internet dropped out again. If anyone else wants to respond to it, feel free.
Can you say that again, please?
Oh, I think it was really just, a recommendation of the book.
Yeah, so part of it was the recommendation of the book for Arendt and Heidegger, but then I was speaking to a previous comment about the exclusion of the private space from the public space, and it didn't matter what you did or where you came from. I thought that was actually really neat, and I was actually tying in a comment from Anne Vroom in the margin. She was talking about how that would sort of belong to the space of forgiveness, and I was just thinking, I mean, that's sort of tying in Christian theology a bit in terms of that would sort of be like it would sort of bring in the notion of grace, and that would sort of free you up from not spending a lot of time sort of working on yourself. I think there can be a lot of focus on like working on yourself instead of like acting positively in the public environment because you're not ready to, or you're not good enough, or something like that. And so I think that that exclusion of the private space allows that sort of that positive action. Anyway, sorry, I was bringing together multiple strands. I think you should probably pass it the other speaker.
Sure, thanks. Okay, Alistair, what would you like to close with?
I guess I have some comments that tie together some of the threads, and also a question to leave Jana with. So I think the question I want to focus on is, how do we enrich the polis, right, with original ideas? And I think this, as many people have said, we need to empower people to challenge power and challenge the narrative in the polis at these town squares, right? Otherwise, we're just using the town square as a way to exercise power, right, and reinforce power. But if we don't allow people to actually challenge the narrative, then original ideas cannot come forth. Having said that, people need to be able to bring forth ideas of their own, right, in order to enrich that polis, to enrich that town square. For example, we bring it up at the beginning of your talk, right? Your question was, hey, I don't want this to be, hey, you just asked me a bunch of questions. Your prompt was, what are your thoughts on the reading, right? So you're inviting people to come into the polis, into the town square, to challenge the narrative, to add to the narrative. But it means that you're asking people to bring something from the private space into the public space, right? You're asking people, well, to what extent have you privately thought about these things, right? And to what extent have you done some creative work of your own to create a counter narrative to what you might hear or not hear, right? So I think that there is that private work that is required. In other words, in order to enrich the public space, the town square, with original ideas, each of us, I think we need to cultivate our own little gardens of ideas, however original or however perfect or imperfect our little carrots and beets are, right? The fact is we have to cultivate something and bring it to the marketplace of the public square. Otherwise, to your question, what are your thoughts on Arendt? We wouldn't be able to say anything, right? So I think to enrich a public square space means a co-enrichment, meaning in the public space, there need to be not only permission, but encouragement, right? For people to bring their full self, for people to challenge power. That's the first condition. And the other condition is to enable people and encourage them to also enrich their private lives. I think that is also important. You probably need both. And I think that ties with Shadi's point about it's actually very difficult to sustain a liberal or progressive agenda, because to sustain a progressive agenda, to create this environment where everyone is co-creating together, right? Or where everyone is co-creating the narrative, forging new paths together for whatever the common cause. In order to do that, in order to challenge the narrative, you can't challenge the narrative simply by resisting the narrative. You actually have to create a counter narrative. It's a creative act. And that creative act requires sustained energy, sustained effort. So if you don't, continue to sustain effort to challenge ideas, then what happens is you begin to slow down, begin to get bogged down by the friction of the current status quo. So I think that's why, having a progressive or liberal movement that is sustained is very difficult, because you have to continuously build up people's capacity for this creative act, and it's a relentless effort against this natural friction that occurs, right? Because by default, the default is the status quo will resist change. The status quo will resist the challenge of power. I think that's how, like Shadi's point is important to recognize that, and it ties to the idea of how do we make the public space more original. Right? In other words, to have this enriched public space full of original ideas, it really does require us to enrich ourselves in a private space with sustained effort. Sustained effort. It cannot be done just one time or whatever. And the tragic part here is that the enemy, or quote unquote, I'm really quote the enemy here, is always there, right? The friction of the status quo is always there, but our will to exercise our creative power is not always there. That's actually something we have to decide moment by moment, right? Day by day, that I will exercise my creative power. And that takes real effort, unfortunately.
I think there's 2 points here, or 2 points that I would like to address. So one is the idea of keeping alive the revolutionary moment, right? And that's in her book On Revolution. So if you're interested in how she accounts for how to keep that moment of foundation alive, right? She talks, in that book, she talks mainly about the French and the American Revolution. And the American Revolution comes out as the revolution that is able to continually found and refound freedom. And create institutions that ascertain the maintenance of freedom and so on, which may sound a little bit, off to you guys. And I encourage you to check out the book On Revolution and to engage with it. The other thing is that I think we have to get away from this liberal idea of public participation needing a certain level of education. Right? I think she would very much assert the idea that everyone can come to the public square, and it's not a matter of education. In fact, she tends to privilege what she calls common sense, right? So what the so-called simple people think and believe, right? And I think in the last couple of years, we've sort of created this aversion to the idea that we should also let people who don't have a PhD speak. But there are plenty of people who if working together can create that originality that you're talking about. So I would maybe caution away from the idea that we sort of breed originality in ourselves. I I just don't think that's true. I mean, you can have amazing ideas, but then when you go to a group, even if it's just like 4 other people and you're planning, you know, a political action, you'll quickly realize that the originality needs to come from the group dynamic. It doesn't come from your like, you know, monstrously fantastic idea that you had about, you know, what to do and how to do it. Everybody needs to be okay with it, obviously, but then there's also sort of like a creative process that happens only in the group, where you birth an idea that wasn't, you know, one single person's brainchild.
Right. So I want to clarify that I'm not saying that you have to breed originality on your own. So you don't have to come to the marketplace with a cake fully baked. But it is important that you have a constructed view. That is to say, you read Arendt, and you have a constructed view about what you believe or don't believe in it, and you have this creative act, right, where you say, well, this is the narrative I want to contribute to what I'm reading so far. So what you bring to the marketplace may not be the full baked cake. It could be half baked cake or whatever. It doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. But to bring forth a view, and I think that creative act is something we have to be willing to do in our private lives, in our private time. And it's a creative act that we actually constantly do through minor habits even, right? Like the gentleman previously said about how we can go around and point, you know, this is bad person or not bad person. These small little things, these small little habits that we do, they contribute to a creative act of a view that we bring forth to the public sphere. And this view doesn't have to be original, it does not, but we need to have it so that we know what we stand for.
And with that, I think this is going to have to be our farewell. This was incredible. This exceeded all of my expectations. Thank you, Jana Schmidt. This was a wonderful presentation. I was expecting a great explication of Hannah Arendt, and you certainly fulfilled our expectations. There's so much to talk about with Hannah Arendt. I certainly actually would very much hope that we can have you back. I think there's a lot more we can cover sometime in the near future. Yeah, and I'll be in touch.
Sure, that would be great.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much for this.
And
thanks everybody for
a really good reading group, and I hope lots of more interruptive discussion.
Certainly, we can arrange different alternatives. I want to thank everybody for joining in. Keep checking the calendar on the meetup. I think the next one is going to be on Philip Reef. That's, I believe, on the 7th, July 7th. That's going to be a good one. Jonathan Imber will be our presenter for that one. Thanks very much for everybody who was here and for your great questions. And thank you again, Jana Schmidt. This was wonderful. All right, and I hope everybody has a good evening.
Likewise. Bye.